Good evening, students. This is an introduction to developmental theories. And in this chapter and unit, we will talk about the various theories that shape growth and development, beliefs, opinions, strengths, and weaknesses. And we will examine various theories throughout this unit. So let's begin by looking at our learning objectives for the unit. We will talk about why do we need theories in developmental science? Why do we study theory? What is so important about it? We will summarize and talk about the 3 parts of personality and 5 psychosexual stages in Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytical theory of development. We will examine that briefly here, but talk about it more in depth during class discussion. We will also summarize Erikson's stages of psychosocial theory. We will summarize operant conditioning, B.F. Skinner, which is a learning theory. We will also talk about classical conditioning, what it is. John B. Watson is the founder of that theory. Behaviorism. And we'll talk about the differences between operant conditioning and classical conditioning and give some examples. We will summarize Bandura's social cognitive theory, which is a learning theory, and his theory of observational learning and what he believed about that as it referred to how children grow socially and develop. We will talk about Piaget's theory of cognitive development, who is one of the leading cognitive developmentalists of theory that we still use today. Finally, we will talk about systems theory and what that means and how one's fit in that situation. So why do we study theory in development? For one, it helps researchers gain the needed information through which they can interpret and explain specific facts and or observations. Remember, we said theories can be proven or disproven. It also guides the collection of new facts and observations once an experiment or a study has been conducted. What is important to the study? What can be hypothesized or predicted about a particular study? And how should the study be conducted? How should we study it? And we've already talked about various research designs that they use, but there are specific designs that we use to study development, and we will talk about that more in the chapter. So let's begin by briefly summarizing Piaget's theory of cognitive development, and this is Piaget, Jean Piaget, who was a French developmentalist of child theory. And he summarized 4 theories, 4 stages. He said that children go through 4 stages and at certain ages, and at each stage that they are able to perform certain tasks because of their cognitive development. So his first stage is called the sensoromotor stage, which he says is from birth to 2 years. And here children supposedly have a sense of coordination with the motor responses, the sensory curiosity about the world, language used for demands and for cataloging information, and something called object permanence. And we'll talk about object permanence. That's the sensoromotor stage from ages 0 to 2 years. Now, the next stage that he said children progress through is the pre-operational stage, which is from age 2 to 7 years. Here in this stage, they have what is known as symbolic thinking, use of proper syntax. They can, in other words, they can make complete sentences. and they can use grammar to express full concepts. They use imagination, and they're very intuitive at this age, but they cannot think abstract. And this kind of thought is still difficult. It takes a while for children to learn to use abstract ideas. And we talk about conservation, and we'll talk about what that means as well. Then the next stage, he says children progress through, is the concrete operational stage, which is from age 7 to 11 years. Here he says that they have concepts attached to concrete situations such as time, space, and quantity are understood and can be applied, but not as independent concepts. In other words, they have to see it, they have to touch it, they have to manipulate it. That is the concrete operational stage. Then this final stage, he says they go through, is what we call formal operations, age 11 years on. And the formal operational stage is always developing. It is theoretical, it's hypothetical, it's counterfactual thinking. And now they are able to think logically and reason and use abstract ideas. They don't have to see it, they don't have to touch it, they can think about it and they can imagine it. And they can do strategic planning. And the concepts learned in one context can be applied to another situation. In other words, they can use what they learn in one grade and carry it on to the next grade. That is the formal operational stage. And this is Piaget's stage of cognitive development. Now, the next developmentalist we want to talk about is Erikson. Erik Erikson's stage of psychosocial development, his psychosocial theory. So now he says that children develop psychologically as well as socially at the same time. And so his stages are a little bit different. And here he has the approximate age, what should happen if in certain stages, and if these stages are met, they should be able to perform one stage. But he says they should be able to perform one stage before going to another stage. So here in Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, his first stage is infancy, which is the first year of life. Here they develop trust versus mistrust. If needs are dependably met, infants develop a sense of basic trust. In other words, they are very dependent at a very young age. Then the next stage is the toddler stage, which is the second year of life. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. Well, in this stage, we know that toddlers like to be independent. They like to do things by themselves. And then they learn to exercise will, or they doubt their abilities. They like to feel that they can do things all by themselves. This is the toddler stage, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Then the next stage is that preschool years, 3 to 5 years. This stage is called initiative versus guilt. And in this stage, preschoolers learn to initiate tasks and carry out plans, or if they can't do it, they feel guilty about not being able to be independent. That is the preschool stage, initiative versus guilt. Then once they get into elementary school years, 6 years to puberty, competency versus inferiority is what this stage is called. And here is where children learn the pleasure of applying themselves to tasks, or they feel inferior. They like to be able to think that they can do it and they can accomplish or they do feel embarrassed and inferior if they can't accomplish. So this is a very critical stage that children go through. This is the elementary school years, puberty, competency versus inferiority. Then once they get into that adolescent stage, 13 years to the 20s. And here, the developmental crisis here is identity versus role confusion. And we know that this is where they learn to become very insecure about who they are and what they want. And they have a strong sense of identity. They want to belong. And if they are successful with dealing with this crisis, they become confused, they withdraw, and they don't want to blend in with the crowd. So this is very critical too. This is the adolescent stage, identity versus role confusion. Then the next stage, he says, is the early adulthood, 20s to 30s. Here the crisis in this stage is intimacy versus isolation. And this is the stage where they start to have intimate relationships, develop romance with individuals. And of course, if they are unsuccessful in dealing with this crisis, they will be feeling isolated from other people, and they may even suffer and feel lonely. So this is a very critical time for early adulthood. Then they progress to middle adulthood, 40s to 50s. And this stage is where the individual begins to sort of really settle. They're already settled. They've already had a good work life. And this is called generativity versus stagnation. Here they're more creative, productive, and nurturing and loving. They're enjoying life and mostly their jobs, preparing for retirement. And of course, if they are unsuccessful in dealing with this crisis, they will be passive, they will feel self-centered, they feel like they have not done anything for the next generation, and they feel that the world is no better off their being alive. They start to feel really kind of gloom and doom. And a lot of them become very depressed during this stage, what they call that midlife crisis. Then in late adulthood to death, 65 and on, this stage here is called ego integrity versus despair. And if they are successful dealing with this crisis, they enjoy life and they don't fear death because they feel like they've lived and they are ready and they are prepared for that stage of life. But if they are unsuccessful in dealing with this crisis, they will feel that their life is empty and they will feel death. So middle adulthood and late adulthood are two of the stages that Erikson feels that most people have problems in. So this is Erikson's stages of psychosocial developmental theory. Now we come to my favorite person to talk about, Sigmund Freud, who dealt with the conscious and the unconscious. And he said that the personality had three structures. And he said it was like an iceberg, as you can see here in this picture. Here we have the ego. Then we have the ego, which is reality principle, which is the preconscious material just beneath the surface of awareness. He's in the conscious is contact with the outside world. The unconscious, difficult to retrieve material well below the surface of awareness. And he said that all of the psychic energy is in the unconscious. Here, and this is where the id is, the wish fulfillment, which is the biological component. The superego is also below the surface, which contains conscious and the ego ideal, which is the moral aspect of the personality. And Freud believed that one could bring things from the unconscious into the conscious and to satisfy or cure whatever was wrong with them. But he is no longer quoted today. And of course, the id is that pleasure principle. Ego is the reality principle. The superego is the moral aspect of our personality. And we'll talk more about Freud. And of course, Freud's psychosexual stages, he said that children develop from early on. Certain things go on. That if they don't accomplish certain things, that they have certain crises and anxieties. And of course, his stages, the first stage of his development is the oral stage, ages 0 to 1. This is that focus on the libido here, the mouth, the tongue, and the lips, and everything we know from infancy they put into their mouths. He said the major developmental crisis here is a weaning off of the breast and the feeding of formula. And of course, if they don't accomplish this, they become fixated, smoking, and overeating because of this oral development not being accomplished. Then there's the anal stage, ages 1 to 3. Of course, the focus of libido here is the anus, toilet training. And if they don't accomplish this, they become asphyxiated as an adult, becoming messy, not being orderly. Then after the anal stage is the phallic stage, ages 3 to 6. Then they are asphyxiated with the genitals, resolving the Oedipus and the Electra complex. And we'll talk more about that as well. And they will become asphyxiated, become sexual deviancy, and become dysfunctional if they don't resolve this area. Then there's the latency stage, ages 6 to 12. And this stage, there's no focus here. But the major development here is developing defense mechanisms. And defense mechanisms are ways that we use to solve anxieties. And we will be going over some defense mechanisms at a later date. And there's no asphyxiation here. And then the last stage is the genital stage, 12 years and up, just like the phallic stage. They are associated with the genitals, they're fixated on genitals here, reaching for sexual maturity, puberty. And here it says if all stages were successfully completed, then the person should be sexually mature and mentally healthy. But that's what Freud believed, and not all of his colleagues agreed with him on this theory. And we will talk about some of these strengths and weaknesses. Now, we want to switch and talk about another theory, which is a learning theory, classical conditioning, which was coined by John B. Watson. It is a learning theory, which means that where he said a stimulus comes to elicit a response through its association with an unconditioned stimulus. What is learned is emotional reactions and pleasant association. And in this diagram, we will talk more about neutral stimulus during conditioning, and we'll talk about these different stages here. We just want to briefly tell you that classical conditioner is an associated learning. B.F. Skinner is another learning theorist. he emphasized the role of development in controlling behavior. He said that a learner's behavior becomes more or less probable depending upon the consequences it produces. In operant conditioning, a learner first behaves in some way rather than reaching or reacting to a stimulus, as in classical conditioning, and then comes to associate this action with positive or negative consequences that follows. And he said that people tend to repeat the behaviors that have desirable consequences and cut down on behaviors that have undesirable consequences. So it's all about consequences, enforcement, punishment, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, also, Skinner, to illustrate what he, in his conditioning, he had when he did for the Skinner box experiment, where each time the rat presses the lever, he would be delivered a pellet, and he learned that by pressing that he would be rewarded with the pellet. So the lever would be the operant, and pressing the lever and receiving the pellet would be the enforcer. And so we are going to talk about this a little bit more, and you will have some other examples. Then we'll talk about reinforcement versus punishment. Here, a positive reinforcement, which is reward, is if you add something that increases the behavior, and negative reinforcement, escape, when you take something away that also decreases the behavior and encourages positive behavior. Then punishment, presentation punishment. Add something, remove punishment, removal of punishment, or negative punishment decreases the behavior. So punishment decreases behavior and reinforcement increases behavior. And students often get these confused, but we'll make sure that you don't. In this slide, you see Albert Bandura with a social cognitive theory, observational learning, learning about observation of other people, known as modeling. Bandura stated, by learning from and imitating other people, children can master skills, whether they're positive or negative. And as you can see, in 1965, he conducted an experiment, and he demonstrated that children could learn a response that was not solicited or by a conditioned stimulus, as in classical conditioning, nor performed and then strengthened by a reinforcement, as in operant conditioning. And in this experiment, you see he took some nursery school children and he let them watch a short film in which an adult model attacked a Bobo doll, and then the children continuously watched it, and they started doing what they saw the adult do in the film, and he called this observational learning. And this was his social cognitive theory, and we'll talk more about that. Finally, Yuri von Braunwiener, who was a bioecological model, developed what was called systems theory. He was a Russian-American psychologist, and he founded one of the first Head Start programs. He was a co-founder, and he sought to understand how a person and the environmental systems in which the person is embedded interact over time to produce a development. And as you can see here, there are several levels that he developed: the microsystem, the ecosystem, and the macro system. And in each system, you notice there's the extended family, community health service, immediate family, child care. In other words, all of these, an individual is embedded in some way in these particular systems, and they are interconnected. So this is just a brief overview of developmental theories. Be sure you watch this. We will do some developmental activities in class. If you have questions, jot them down, bring them to class, and we'll discuss them more. Questions? See you in class.